Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
Hi, I'm Susan, and I'm a college counselor and have read applications for a small liberal arts college and 2 research universities. My twins are recent college graduates.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of 2 daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a graduate of the University of Georgia, and she is getting her master's degree at North Carolina State University. Friends, I'm here with Susan Tree for episode 237. Hey, Susan, how are you?
I'm good, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Oh, always exciting for us to talk. What our listeners don't know is we've already had a marathon session before now, so we should be in rare form.
That's right. We're never at a loss for things to talk about.
No, most definitely. It's always great. Friends, just last night I had a conversation with a student from Illinois, and the student said, Mark, I've got a problem. I've got my college list at 16, and I'm just having the hardest time getting it lower. Well, this is how I've changed and evolved over the years. There was a time that I would have said, you absolutely, unequivocally have to get that lower. And you may have heard me say that I recommend students apply to 7 to 13 schools. That is true, but I need to give a lot of qualifiers to that. That's oftentimes the range that makes sense for a student doing a national search. Our regular podcasters know Anika used to be my co-host, co-founder. Working with her daughter, Naya, it didn't make any sense for her to apply to that many schools. She knew she wanted to do pre-vet program. She wanted to go to an HBCU. She already loved North Carolina A&T. She was highly likely to be admitted there. And so having 3 or 4 schools was really all she needed. Sometimes I'll have students that do BSMD programs or very competitive theater arts programs that need more than 13 schools. Sometimes I'll work with a student that's extremely organized and they can get all of their applications done, almost all of them done over the summer. That student could apply to 16 more efficiently or effectively than another student could who applies to 4 or 5 that waits to do everything in the fall. So I'm here to say as my admissions tip, there is no magic number, and don't let anybody tell you. I do like the wisdom from Rebecca Sapke. You know, I'm a big fan of her book, Valedictorians at the Gate. Do not apply to more schools than you can do a comprehensive visit to, whether before you apply or after you apply. I like that. You're not going to go to school sight unseen in most instances. So if you're applying to more schools and you're able to thoroughly visit, that's a sign you're applying to too many. Look, do I like to see people get down to 13, 12? Yes. Do I find that some students, not too infrequently, say, you know, I applied to too many schools? Because it's a lot of work to do it well. And I'd like to see every application be A+ and not B+. And increasingly with schools looking at your engagement level, you know, and all these additional essays. But then sometimes schools don't have that many additional essays. And then if a school, let's say someone applies to 5 UCs, do you count that as 5 or 1? It's 1 application. So I'm here to say there's no perfect number, and don't let anybody tell you anything other than that. And that is my admissions tip. And it's not advice that I would have even given before. And I'm sure I have a lot of college counselors rolling over in their grave here, because you can create more work for the college counselor, and most people are not organized and efficient. And most people do not put the research in that they should do ahead of time to be able to limit. It's easy to just say apply to 8, apply to 10, apply to 12. But what you're not taking into consideration, there's just so many unique circumstances. And I would be wrong if I did not tell you that I have had students apply to 18 schools and do it very well. I have had that happen. But they were incredibly organized. They worked well in advance. They used their summer of their rising senior year to get most of the work done. So your number is your number. And Just make sure. I do believe that every application should be very thorough, very well done, with lots of research done. So sometimes when people start in this process, when I recommend end of the sophomore year, they're able to position themselves to have mid to high teens of applications. I am happy that the Common App cuts it off at 20 and will not allow you to go beyond that. I think that's smart. And I hope that never changes. So Susan, I'm very excited because Susan's going to give our admissions tip. And it's one I'm really excited to hear you talk about. So take it away, Susan.
Well, there's so many little tips when it comes to filling out applications, and the more experience you have with them, the more kind of little ways you can think of for students to bring more of themselves into an application, because that's really the bottom line is students have to think of themselves both holistically and as well as all the little factors that go into making them who they are and different from everyone else. Applications can make kids look a lot the same. And as someone who's read applications for a number of different kinds of colleges and universities, a lot of kids are, they hang back when it comes to how different and how unique or unusual they want to appear, because they think they're being measured up to some standard of whatever a college is looking for, where really colleges just want them to let their personality, their character, their love of learning, their academic interests shine through. So a few years ago, in the Common Application and in the Coalition application, the participating colleges invited students to write about their last few years, their high school experience in terms of circumstances that disrupted or interrupted or impacted in some way on their experience in high school. Obviously, this got nicknamed the COVID question early on. It's part of the additional information section on the Common Application, and it's actually in the common half of the Common Application. Anyone who's worked with the Common App knows that only about half of it is common to all the member colleges, and the other half are institutional specific supplements. But this was important enough to the membership, the 1,000 colleges, however many it is now that are members, and the hundreds that are on Coalition, that it now, given what was been going on for the last few years. And, I'm very quick to read through that with students I work with now so that they understand really what is being asked. The wording is such that it's an open, I think it's 250 words, space for the student to talk about their perception of how, whether it was a wildfire in Washington State or Nevada or California, or a mudslide in the canyons of Southern California. I remember kids are still writing about Hurricane Harvey in Houston. These enormously impactful natural events that took away the normal routine of their school experience. In some cases, robbed them of their home and their possessions, or displaced them, or took their material possessions away, or even loved ones in some ways. When COVID hit, everybody's attention turned to the pandemic, of course, because the pandemic affected kids near and far. In reading applications, I've read statements from kids whose grandparents in other countries, China, India, were affected by COVID. And then there was the backwash to the family in America. And then there were the kids who had parents who were essential workers and schools were closed. And, we're looking at rising seniors now, Mark, whose schools shut down in March of ninth grade. And in many cases, especially in public schools, were remote for all of 10th grade. So, what I say to kids is this space helps colleges understand how you learned, not only what you and your family's experience of the interruption, the disaster was, but how you then redefined learning for yourself. How did you redefine sports? How did you redefine the arts? How did you redefine Spanish or pre-calculus or whatever it was, where suddenly you felt kind of on your own, with maybe some remote help, maybe in some cases that was better than other places. But it's a chance for you to talk about yourself as not just a family and community member, which of course is very, very important. And how did you, in whatever your circumstances were, think about other people? And then how did you rearrange kind of your learning experience?
Well, I'm glad that they've actually changed a little bit of the phraseology for this up and coming Common App to broaden it. And so it's clearer now to talk about the wildfires and things like that, because it was fairly COVID specific
Yes.
in the wording before. And I know a number of admission officers who had said to me, we've all been disrupted by COVID. We couldn't travel, we couldn't have visitors. And so if the disruption was just sort of normal, typical disruption, you may not need to write about it. That's what I have consistently heard from admission officers, that some kids just say the traditional thing in that space. And then have to be careful too that those who talk don't talk in a whiny
Exactly.
sort of excuse making. This is why I don't have many activities and that
here's
kind of
what
thing.
I would have done.
Yes.
That's the one that really gets to me is
Yeah.
Here's what I would have done
Yes.
for that year that I was remote. I was going to be
Yeah.
president of this, and
Right.
I was going to have the lead in that play. It's like, you can share what, for some people, when there's disruption, there's no coming back. There's an inability then to return to something because continuity was lost. And you can say that, absolutely, that's relevant. But again, if the focus can be on, okay, well, what did you do? How did you take responsibility for your either your education or, whatever we all had vast internet resources. If you didn't, if yours was a family where you didn't have those resources to recreate your life in a way that was worth talking about, you really need to say that. There's no shame in that. That if you were, remember those pictures we saw of kids sitting out on the curb in front of, McDonald's to pick up their Wi-Fi signal. There were so many kids that we, middle and upper middle class families don't realize what that was. There were some students who almost lost a full year of school. They should have repeated a grade, but they weren't, allowed to or inclined to. But yes, actually, absolutely think about your tone. Now it is called community disruption. You're right.
It's a lot better.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think it's another interesting and appropriate place to reflect on your learning style. I had a student say to me the other day that in 10th grade, he was able to finish Spanish 2. In 9th grade, in 10th grade, when he was remote, he tried taking Spanish remotely, Spanish 3, but he could not succeed. His learning style, he tried everything under the sun to, but the method of teaching remotely was deadly for him, and he had to drop the class. So then 11th grade this year, he could not come back to it. He explored adding a different foreign language for his junior and senior year because he didn't want colleges thinking he was, a total loser in terms of foreign language. But a lot of kids couldn't do that. So if there is a curricular area where you were really not able to continue, how did you try? How did you try and put pieces together for yourself? But, use that little paragraph to tell your story there without whining. You're right.
Thanks, Susan. And our admissions vernacular is a term I don't hear that often, but I like it. And the term is chip kid. And so some admission officers, leaders, deans, directors, they allow each representative to have one kid that they fell in love with that might not have the numbers and might have a difficult time making it through the committee, and they get that one kid that they're able to get through admissions. And I actually think it's a good concept. Obviously, you're still expected to admit somebody who can do the work, but if you understand how admission officers get attached to kids and how it can break their heart when some of their favorite kids can't get through, I think it's a great thing to take a chance every now on a kid and to keep your admission officers happy and excited. So some schools use the term, I used my chip kid for this kid. So I don't know how many use that. I don't hear it that often. Do you hear that the term at all used, Susan, or not? Not really.
Ancient history, in my experience.
Back in the day,
history. Yeah.
Before it got so competitive that schools took the chip kid away.
Well, I think because admissions counselors are responsible generally for a geographic area where they recruit, they get to know the curriculum, and the guidance counselors and the college counselors, and they read applications. They're usually the first reader or the last reader, depending on how the reading is structured. You can get very attached to schools and also particular kids. And sometimes you're trying to build a relationship with a high school. I mean, interestingly, one of the goals of almost every admissions office is to have as many high schools represented in their first year class as possible. So the old homage to feeder schools really started going away a long time ago. That it's not that you don't have a certain affection as an admission counselor for schools in your territory, and you get to know the kids once they come to your school, but there really are no kids don't have their skids greased because they go to certain schools. And then there's this pressure to, like a good stock portfolio, to diversify your freshman class and have as many high schools represented as possible. So you do, I think, admissions as an admission counselor, root hard within a school group for the kids that you feel will make it through committee, and also really represent that school, and enroll, that you want them to actually come and not turn you down.
Yeah. And I actually just like this concept because I think I sort of see it as a win-win. If you've got a well-trained admission officer, they can oftentimes spot a diamond in a rough who should be okay. And then you help sustain their motivation. And, most of the time, I mean, I haven't done any research on it, but there are kids. And if you know the territory well, right, you can get to know that kid at a different level. A lot of times there's deference to the fact that this is the territory manager who may have met the kid and had more interaction with them. And we're reading paper file, but, you had a good 15-minute conversation with the kid after a fair or something like that. So
right,
there it is, chip kid. Our big number is 100 million. And that is 2017. I was trying to get 18 and 19 data. 2017, the College Board brought in over 100 million from student search. So that's where colleges buy lists of names, around 50 cents a person, but some schools buy 500,000 names, and it's a huge moneymaker for College Board. It's one of the reasons why you may remember I did a big number of 282 million a while ago, which was how much money the College Board had lost from the pandemic, before the pandemic to after. Part of it is less people taking the test, those fees, but then also student search continues to be used, but it loses some of its value a little, Susan, when you move into a test optional world.
That's for sure. You have fewer criteria to search on. Your search points, very questionable.
Yeah.
And now it's time for Hot Topics in the News.
But we have a really exciting article today, which I think you're going to find interesting. And, Susan and I were involved in a few different groups and committees, and where we all share our knowledge as college counselors. And we had been noticing, an uptick in colleges rescinding admission offers and doing it in different ways. And so that's what the article looks at today. Do universities actually rescind their admission offers? And it starts out by saying that you have to read the fine print very carefully on your acceptance letter, because very often you will notice that there is something that says something to the effect of, don't forget, we expect the rest of your senior year to show the same level of work and admirable behavior that you've demonstrated on your application. And so you'll see it oftentimes in admission letters, and you'll often see it on websites as well. And so the article basically says that there are three main different reasons why colleges rescind admission offers. And the first reason is what they call academic decline. And they quote from Harvard, but it could be true of, myriad of institutions, and basically says Harvard tells its admitted students at the time they're admitted, we reserve the right to withdraw the offer if, and they mention three things. One, a student fails to graduate by the end of the current year. I guess that would be obvious. Second, significant drop in their academic performance between the time of the offer and graduation. And third, student drops a year-long course in the second semester when the expectation was that it would be complete. So, Susan, what do you want to say about schools rescinding offers for academic decline?
Well, it's nothing new, first of all, Mark. In fact, one of the most questionable dimensions of my first admissions job, when I worked for a selective liberal arts college in Maine, I was tasked with looking at all 450 final transcripts.
I didn't know this.
Yeah, no, this is where I started this shady part of my career. I was the one that had to review it, and it actually made sense in a way for one person to do it, because you established a standard. And the first thing that I learned when I would make that review during the month of June was most seniors decline a little. Especially, now I'll ask you, I'll quiz you on this, Mark. Which subgroup of first-year student?
Early decision.
You're right.
Yeah.
You're right. Absolutely. Well, they had the longest period of time, too, in which to decline. They were the ones who knew we probably wouldn't be seeing mid-year grades, right? They were admitted on the strength of what was going on in the fall term. We had a fall marking period set of grades for those kids. And then they knew it was a long time till June. They were the biggest declines. Who were the smallest declines? The least obvious decline in the first year class. The opposite end of the scale.
Someone was either waitlisted, so they were taken really late in the process.
Yep.
It's because the school has more access to more records before they made the decision.
And those kids who wanted to get off the wait list, remember, this would be in the month of April and early May, right? When the wait lists were moving. They were sending in current grades to show how well they were doing. And, it was part of their campaign to get off the wait list. So that was always kind of an irony between the EDs and the wait lists.
Sure.
Who was really trying. But anyway, my job involved was identifying the degree of decline, because a decline could mean what? And we actually had a rubric so that there was consistency. So, a loss of a grade level in one class or half a grade level in more than one. And those were declines, but they were not flagged. The students were not contacted. Nobody was reacting.
Well, even Harvard uses the word significant in there.
Yes, but and that remains to be seen. We had these three levels. There was decline. What was it? There was 1, 2, and 3. Insignificant but noticeable, right? Then moderate and serious. So the kids in the middle, and the rubric was like, a full grade level in more than one class, and looked at in context.
Sure.
To see what that meant, and if there was an explanation, and I'll comment on that in a second. It's much better if you've got a decline headed to your college on the transcript, that you beat it there with the description, with an explanation, right? Get ahead of that news. But the serious declines were kids who, something had happened, and it might have even involved the lack of a D at the end of the year. And you have to remember these kids getting in early and regular were, A and B students in a rigorous curriculum. So a D was really, really noticeable. But you know what? In all my years at the college, we asked those kids to, if they could, come to campus and meet with us. We didn't really have any intention of rescinding their application unless they gave us another good reason.
Well, I think another thing, this hasn't come up in this article, but there's something in between rescinding and doing nothing, which some schools do, which is people starting out on probation.
Right.
And some schools do that. You're
Right.
going to have to start with probationary status just to hold people accountable.
We called it, there was admonishment, which was basically saying, we noticed and we're disappointed. We expected better from you. And then there was the, you're going to start in some relationship with the dean's office. Once in a while, if there was a failure, yes, we might say to the student, you really can't come in the fall. Let's work out a plan for the future. And then that student would either come a semester or 2 semesters later. Sometimes they needed to take some time off, that there was perhaps a subconscious self-sabotage going on. I often would call the school counselor and get a third-party opinion. Not all schools will talk to admissions people about things like that if they don't divulge information, but some counselors would advocate for their students, but what we would hope for would be some kind of explanation. I mean, we had kids who had been in car accidents and been out of school. We had kids where there were deaths in the family. And clearly, once we knew what was going on in the student's life, there was nothing but sympathy and support. But then we could also be active in lining up support for that student. The big no-no was when a student changed their course program without our permission.
Well, I was going to ask you that. I was going to ask you, well, first of all, in your 27 years at Westtown, how many times did you recall someone was actually rescinded over grades? One hand, I'm sure. It wouldn't be more than one hand, I would think.
Actually, I don't remember any over grades. We had any number of calling kids on the carpet.
I've actually had two in the last 3 years, Susan.
Of rescinding? Wow.
Yeah. But one really tanked.
Oh.
One was Pomona, so it's a very selective school. And C's D's. You go from straight A's to C's D's, which was bad. And then one was Yale, but it was straight A's the whole way to 2 C's in the 5 core classes. And that was an interesting one because it was an athlete that another Ivy ended up picking up.
Oh, really? But for no good reason, I gather.
Yeah, they seniors, like you said, there's a reason why it's not uncommon to nose the tapering off, senior slump, senioritis, but without a really good reason. Now, in the case of one, they worked really, really hard to try to see. They said, we would love to have you back in another year. We would love to see that application. So they really wanted that to happen. And so, but those are a pretty bad dropout. I like to bring that up. And I'm glad you said you almost didn't even see it happen because people can get scared and we don't want to scare people.
Right. I had many, many students come in and say to me, I've gone from an A to a B in 3 of my classes. And what I would do is have them email their admission counselor anyway.
Sure.
I said it's always better to own it.
Yeah.
And communicate. And these were kids who weren't quite sure where the grade was going to end up because it was before finals.
Sure.
In their senior year.
Well, a lot of times there is a reason, like you said, too. A lot of times there is a reason, right? And with the reason and foreknowledge, a lot of times you'll encounter grace.
Absolutely. I mean, they had good reasons to admit you in the first place.
Right. When they admit you, they want you. Yeah.
That's right.
Well, listen, I think I cut you off, but you were about to talk about something very important, which is change in curriculum.
Yeah. That was far more common in my years as a school-based college counselor, where And even though with juniors, when we were doing the college counseling for rising seniors, I always elevated that point, saying what you commit to in the fall is what you're going to graduate with, unless it's a one semester course, of course, right?
Sure, sure.
Some kids can strategize,
Right, government or
that a little
something.
bit,
Yeah.
but not if it's, AP physics, electricity, and magnetism, or,
Hmm.
a year-long course, or you don't, there's no trading unless you have the permission of the college that has admitted you. And even for kids where, once it was on their transcript for the fall term, they had to inform the colleges that they had applied to that they were making a change. So this would have been in like January, where the applications had been submitted, but then the student wanted to make a change. And I said, well, I'll help you draft the email. But part of it was, for me, this was a life lesson. This is how we live our lives as adults. We reason through our decisions. We get advice. We make a decision. It's risk management, right, at its best. And then you anticipate the response. And I found admissions counselors were uneven in their responses to, I'd like to change, my program. If it was an even trade, like if you were trading a advanced level history class for an advanced level religion class, or, whatever, often that was perceived as an even trade. And the colleges would say, that doesn't concern us. But if it wasn't an even trade, or if it was a complete, I had 6 classes and now I'm only going to have 5, then, some admissions counselors would say, well, your application is going through an evaluation process now, and it's very important that you let us know this. But you know what? If the student wrote a mature explanation about an opportunity that had come up, that they needed more flexibility in their schedule, an internship suddenly they had an opportunity to take for the second half of their senior year, but it meant rearranging things a little bit. Again, it's you sell the idea. But if you're just going to drop and hope they don't notice it, that's the worst case scenario.
So what did you see, both all the way back to, your experience before you went on the college side or after, in terms of the consequences? Because, when you're at Westtown, you're telling all the students. Your caseload is small enough, you're in a small, intimate setting, and you're letting every student know you need to inform the schools. But you're coming from a big public school. There's the majority of people wouldn't even know to even tell anybody. They wouldn't even necessarily know that they should. So did you see rescinding happen off of this, or did you see some other admonition and guidance, scare the bejesus out of people without rescinding? Like what did you see typically there, both when you were, in the liberal arts side, pre-Westtown and post-Westtown, as you've done advising to several schools?
Well, it really depends on the degree of the, and whether or not there appeared to be a cover-up. Mm-hmm. My feeling is the devil you knew was better than the devil you didn't know. And any student who was proactive and open in their communication with the admissions office, whether it was before acceptance or after acceptance, generally was treated with respect. There might have been, I wish we'd known, I would have argued with you about that. But, if the student made a decision that seemed to be reasonable and they were telling the college about it, now how that would play in at different schools, I don't know. But if there doesn't appear to be dishonesty or a lack of integrity, then there, like you said, there usually is some understanding. The student might get a slap on the wrist and say, well, once you're here and enrolled and under our care, this is the kind of thing you would be expected to meet with your advisor and talk it through with the advisor or a dean. And that's a good, a good lesson. But, not a lot. The rescinding of admissions came, aside from the academic disaster cases that you described, was more behavioral.
All right. Well, let's segue in transition to that, because as the article talks about, there's three ways, but and we've just talked about academics so far, and there are a couple others. But just to get clarity on that, though, it sounds like what I'm hearing you say, Susan, you still didn't see a lot of rescinding for changes in program. There was maybe addressing it and disappointment, but not necessarily rescinding.
Well, that's why you read the fine print, though, in
Sure.
the acceptance, especially in the acceptance letter, because
Sure.
there are going to be some acceptance letters for ED. The EDs might be worded even more strongly to that point.
And also, as we get into more and more competitive pools, the bar is different at a school with a single-digit admit rate versus a school with a 70% admit rate, because they're just passing on extraordinary kids.
That's right.
That is a factor. So the second point in the article is what they call unacceptable behavior, which we know is a factor. And so it goes on to say, once again, quoting from Harvard, the acceptance may be rescinded if the student engages in behavior that brings into question the student's honesty, maturity, or moral character. Unacceptable behavior includes things like your posts on social media, and it talks about several high-profile cases. And we've seen this. I mean, it's happened at this institution right here, Harvard. They had a bad case a while ago, posting, comments, racist comments, sexist comments, bullying, homophobic. Those kinds of things don't go over well, and language. There's other behavior as well. I remember talking to director of admission at the University of Georgia a few years ago, and they rescinded a kid who showed up in the paper for shoplifting, So there's can be other things besides social media. So what do you want to say that you've seen here in the unacceptable behavior category, Susan?
Well, I think it falls in a way into two categories. There is the student being given a high school diploma is really the first point, because if the student is still going to be allowed to graduate from a school, the college may never find out, especially if they have a policy that prohibits the sharing of student conduct information with the colleges, which a lot of public high schools have that policy that, college counselors, guidance counselors, school counselors may not ever share what is referred to as student conduct information. So, but where a high school does have a policy, because they use the sharing of information of school discipline information as a way to control it, as a deterrent, then between the point of the student being admitted to the college and graduating, they may be obligated to share that. When I had students at our school who were disciplined at the school, if it rose to the level of a suspension, meaning a separation, temporary separation from the school, then the student would craft a letter to the college, and I would craft a letter that would follow that letter in support of them. The sad thing is that it was very short amount of timing. When discipline happens earlier in a student's career, there's more time to reflect on growth. Whereas, for seniors who just are yahoos and, whether they're slicing the tires of, cars in the parking lot, or, doing something that's property damage related or sexual misconduct, kind of things that would be in the face of the school and on school property, it's very, very worrisome. One of my first experiences at our independent school was a group of seniors who literally the night before graduation broke into the school store on a lark and were caught. And they were not allowed to walk, and receive their diploma. There was a disciplinary process that then incurred, and their colleges, it was interesting because their colleges were all notified. They were given diplomas, in absentia, but the 3 colleges where they were going each reacted in a completely different way. One lost their acceptance, and they were invited to, repent and then come back another year, but their place was not held for them.
Sure.
Another was they were officially kind of suspended for the first semester. They could not come to first year orientation or anything like that, but they could come later. And the third one was they were allowed to matriculate in the fall, and they had 1,000 hours of community service debt to pay.
That's a lot.
It was astronomical.
Yeah.
It was
a lot.
And the interesting thing is that student later came back to Westtown and talked. He had become, this was just one of those happily ever after stories. He actually had risen to leadership of the service organization at that university, and then after graduation went into Vista or the Peace Corps or something like that. I mean, it changed his life. The punishment fit the crime in a way. And but again, colleges are they're very sensitive to behavior that if it had occurred on their campus, the student would have been separated, suspended, or expelled. So that's why it varies, where a high school student who drinks at the prom and is suspended is treated potentially differently than the student who is part of a cheating academic dishonesty ring of funneling exam questions to multiple sections, of the same class, which rises to the level of probably expulsion at college, whereas an alcohol violation wouldn't.
But wouldn't you say you've seen more rescinding for behavior than academic
Yes.
declension? Yeah, same for me.
Yeah. I think colleges are worried about, on one hand, they want to look at these kids as works in progress. And, truthfully, a lot of young people learn their most valuable lessons when they're caught.
That's true.
When they're not caught, they are not learning squat, except that you can get away with stuff.
That's why parents really do a disservice when they go into cover-up mode. And we've seen this. Susan and I have seen this. We've talked about it live in action with students that we know, obviously being appropriate to mention that here. But we've often said, what lesson are you teaching your kid? Because a lot of times parents go into that mode and of defense, and I'm going to do everything I can to almost act like I'm your attorney and get you out of this thing. And it's really, really unfortunate. It's better to take the hit and learn that life lesson now than learn the lesson of how can I scheme and cover up and get away with it.
I agree entirely. And I would say most colleges, not all colleges, but some colleges believe that there is no double jeopardy, meaning that if the school handled the discipline, then it's done, and that it's not their job as a college where the student hasn't even matriculated yet to punish the student again. And that's a real difference among institutions from my experience. Some absolutely feel it's within their right to, in a way, do risk management and protect their community, potentially from a student who may be a bad actor or, again, engage in a behavior that would hurt other people at their institution.
I mean, that's so understandable. So I'll just take something that I've seen happen more than a few times. Susan has as well, which is stealing and theft. That's a real concern to a school, unless they're convinced that there's contrition. That kind of thing really, really can break trust down. This topic gets really complicated. The article goes on to say that, universities also reserve the right to, implement their punishments if they learn about this long afterward, even.
That's right.
And actually, one example of that was Varsity Blues, where some of the people, they had serious consequences when it was found out that they fabricated their way in. I attended a session. I was getting some additional admissions training through Harvard SECA training for admissions counselors, and they have us break out in groups. And I attended one with Logan Powell, who's the VP of Enrollment at Brown. And it was on this topic. And it was on us emphasizing with our students that just because you get in, it doesn't mean you're guaranteed your spot. And he covered this topic in depth of unacceptable behavior, as well as the next thing we're going to talk about in a second, the third point. But I realized how complicated it was, Susan, when he said, we as an institution deal with students in the same school ratting out other students. And we can't help but look at it, even if it was malicious, and students start sending us pictures or sending us emails, and now we have an obligation to look into it.
That's right.
And so the point that he was making is tell your students they cannot be circumspect enough, because you might think that that picture you took or that email you sent was private, and then you get in and somebody else is maybe jealous that you get in and they didn't, and it gets circulated, and now they send it to us. And now that we have knowledge of what you the student did, we have responsibility to protect our community, and we are going to research it. And so that's how this whole unacceptable thing can really get complicated.
That's right. You're absolutely right. And there's just, I don't know if you remember the Harvard case, and I would have to look up the date, but this was possibly in the 80s or 90s. I think I was still in admissions. Maybe I don't remember.
Sure.
But there was an applicant from the South who actually had been involved in a homicide. But it was I don't want, people
Sure.
can Google on it if they're really interested, but it was a case of abuse, and the student had, defended herself, and it was taken to court, and then it was not taken to trial. It was just, I don't know if it was whatever that was, it never, but anyway, when she got into Harvard, everybody from her hometown apparently started sending news clippings to the admissions office at Harvard. And that was the first time I ever remember this situation. And Harvard rescinded her admission, even though the court had sealed the records because she was underage. So that was a very touchy situation. So in the meantime, I remember other colleges started reaching out to her saying, you come here. This was the wrong thing for that school to do. If you were good enough to get into Harvard, we assume you're good enough to come here. But, we believe in you, blah, blah, blah. And Harvard eventually, I don't know if there was legal action, had to reverse their decision, but she went elsewhere for obvious reasons. But that was the first time, and I should look up the date on that just out of curiosity. It was the first time. It was before the internet. Let's put it that way.
It's been worse now. So transitioning to our third topic, our third subpoint, and this is false information. And this is actually a really big one. And once again, I'm going to draw off a couple things. The session with Logan Powell was just a small group of us, 15 maybe, that were meeting with him. And this was right after Varsity Blues had broke. And he was unequivocal that there would be new vigilance in the Brown admission office at auditing extracurriculars. They couldn't do it for every single person, but they were going to randomly start auditing extracurriculars to make sure there was not embellishment in the activities. And they were going to have a new antenna up for stuff that looked suspicious. And there were several other admission leaders there that were also espousing the same thing. And Susan and I, as I say, we're in a couple different college counseling groups, and we've heard that Brown has been fairly strict in their enforcement. They've stuck to that, both actually for the second point we made about unacceptable behavior, as well as taking a look. Did you really do all those things that you said you did in your activity section? At the conference, was a senior level person there from the UCs. And they said they've been doing this for 30 years.
That's right.
It's been a random audit they've done. But it was very clear that Varsity Blues was a wake-up call to a lot of colleges, even ones that were not named, where their coaches weren't named. They looked at that and they saw, look, we can't completely bulletproof our process because, you can't hire a team of private investigators to investigate everybody's extracurriculars. But they saw how it kind of exposed some of the weaknesses in the current system and how it's built on trust. And so what can we do to at least shore it up so, we're not taken to the cleaners? So what do you want to say about this one, Susan, which is people falsifying information? We've talked about it on a few times. We talked about it when the student from the University of Pennsylvania, that abuse case that came up, the Rhodes Scholar, that was seen as someone back from her whole time said she'd made up the whole abuse case. We talked about that not too long ago on the podcast. We also had a conversation about people fabricating their race, in checking boxes. But I want to know whatever you want to say. We didn't talk about it before, but I know you've got a lot of knowledge to draw off. So take it where you want to go.
Well, it's interesting to think of how colleges might police this. Clearly, those of us who work with high school kids need to always be emphasizing how important it is to represent yourself, with truth to power. It's a matter of pride. You represent yourself with honesty. You're probably more special than you think you are. You don't have to try and make yourself be more special. But kids, in a lot of cases, have a chip on their shoulder. They feel at a disadvantage. And what they don't realize, of course, is that by exaggerating, first of all, it's usually not very believable when you look at it from the outside, and that the application can really appear contrived. It can, because you don't have evidentiary information, and also the misperception that it matters how many clubs you're in or how many leadership positions, that someone's actually quantifying that and caring about it rather than about the quality of your involvement and the impact you've had on your school and your community. There's that idea of the longer the resume, the more impressive it is. And all of us in the real world know that's not true. That depth over, quality over quantity, depth over breadth, every time carries more information, more emotion. It's why Common App, won't grow that activities grid any bigger.
Keep it at 10.
They just won't do it. Now, kids can obviously find ways to share more information than just those 10 line items. But so that, that's the point of, what's the impression you're trying to make, and why do you think it's believable if you're not? Well, I guess some kids are inventing the evidence too.
I've never seen this in my experience. I haven't had a kid I've worked with that had a rescinded admission because of embellishment of activities. So I'm a little not drawing off of a big experiential pool here, but I can think of all the things you could do. You could make up awards and claim you had national stature and things like that. Did you encounter this at all with Bates in the audits at this point, or was that more just academic that you were doing the review? How much have you seen of this in your experience where a school got back and said, we don't believe the things that this could put down that they actually did, or maybe they don't even start out that way. They say we're doing a little bit of an investigation.
Right. I don't ever remember even thinking about this when I was at Bates, but it was another time. It was another day and another time. And there wasn't the pressure on kids at that point to feel like they had to do that. I mean, maybe they were just very good at it and we didn't see it, right?
It's possible.
That's.
But you bring a good point. There's a whole different level of pressure that kids feel now, and the lower the admit rates, the more it puts pressure on kids. And there seems to be more, just obsession with I need to go to certain schools to have the life that I think I want to live. I mean, this is something we aggressively push back on as counselors, but it's just out there in the ether that this is a fork in the road type of decision for my life if I don't get XYZ designer school.
That's right.
And that puts pressure on. And so I think that's a good point for you to bring up.
Well, and when I'm reading applications and I'm looking at the extracurricular activities grid, what you're looking for is themes and development over a period of years. You're looking for the caring, the passion for the activity, because it's not what you've done. In rare cases, maybe, but it's not how many hospitals you volunteered at or how many honor societies you were in. It's what you did for other people. It's how you took whatever experiences you were fortunate to have, and how you what initiative you took to get there, or were these just handed to you, right? Initiative and impact. And this is what I say to families over and over again. In 9th and 10th grade, it's typical to see interest and involvement. Kids are trying things out. They're trying to figure out, what do I like to do? How good am I at these different things? But then by junior year, you're looking for initiative to begin to surface. And that doesn't necessarily mean a leadership position. Again, the pandemic changed a lot of how we think about these things. And then there's impact. The self-aggrandizement, it does not make a good impression. And that would be the student I would be suspicious. Sometimes you read an application and you just say, this is not believable.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not believable. But you know what? My job reading an application isn't necessarily to judge them, but because the university I worked for this year also had a character rubric, that was where you would kind of factor in the believability of, and well, you know what I mean.
Sure.
I'm overstating this, but the thing about these audits, and I know Brown's is the most clearly articulated as part of their statement on integrity in the application process, and as they put it, their ongoing effort to deter application fraud. It's a random process, Mark.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And this I find fascinating because this is the matriculating class. And what they say on their website, it is important to note that those who are designated need not worry. There is no particular concern regarding honesty in these randomly selected cases. So is this like an IRS audit? I mean, don't you just get audited by the IRS if they think something is amiss?
Well, this is how the UCs have done it for 30 years. It's been, I think it's 2%. They take 2% and randomly check. Now, one area where I have flagged with my students, and I know you have as well, and I was also listening to an admission officer, senior level admission officer recently say one of his pet peeves is the student that has inflated hours. And you literally look and you say, that's 100 hours of activities. That is not believable. But of course, we're there to catch that and to point that. And usually in my experience, it's been innocuous. That wasn't necessarily designed to be intentionally deceptive. But I know I catch that at least a couple times a year.
Yeah. Well, sometimes it's because the students, their activities are seasonal. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And they do spend those hours in that activity, like the kids that are getting ready for the Music Educator Association, the MEA districts, regional, states, that there are these windows of time where those kids are putting in 20 hours a week and other things get shoved aside, or when you're in rehearsal for a play, or you're in your season for lacrosse. And so it can look, if you're not realizing that these are not overlapping seasons necessarily, that it can look exaggerated, but sometimes it might be true But we have to look at that, and parents can be helpful to kids in addressing that activities grid. How many kids know how many hours they spend on, it's one thing if you're babysitting every week, you can say, yeah, I usually babysit for 10 hours a week, and because you know what you get paid for. But when your activities like caring for an autistic younger sibling or a fragile grandparent or something like that, or you're a buddy to a student at your school with maybe disabilities.
Let's explain this, Susan, because I think someone may not everyone will follow this. So for the Common App and most applications, you are asked to say the years that you did an activity, the number of weeks in the year that you did the activity, and then the number of hours a week. So this is what we're referring to. And I wish there was a way they could ask it more precisely, because every year you get students that are like, how do I know how many hours to put down? Because while I was working on the play, it was a tremendous amount, but then it wasn't for the rest of the year. And it is tricky. And it does involve some subjectivity. And
sports especially are very hard.
Yes. Yes.
Very hard.
Yeah. Yeah. And so this is a little bit about what Susan and I are talking about. And oftentimes we tell students, just do your best to estimate with a clear conscience.
That's very important.
If people are starting younger in this process, they can do a little chronicling and stuff if they're inclined to track it a little bit to get a sense. But for the most part, most people are just taking their best educated guess.
And it can look exaggerated, but colleges understand that. I mean, it's more what look like leadership positions that are unrealistic in their volume and in the demands. I think the hours the colleges are taking it with a grain of salt, right?
Yeah. I don't think that's normally going to be a rescinding. It's just a pet peeve that can bother people, because once you start seeing inaccuracies, it can cause you to wonder where else are there inaccuracies. It's just some person's sloppy and loose with the truth. But I know what you're talking about, and really more the bigger issues are if you say, you started some national charity and this, that, the other, and or whatever, you won this award and you didn't even do it at all. And it's pure fabrication and it's intentional, malicious in its deceit. That's where you're really going to have an issue.
Right. And how an admission counselor would pick up on that is hard for me to understand. I mean, sometimes it just seems a ridiculous accomplishment. But you know what? Some kids do those kinds of things. It's really quite extraordinary. But then you look for verification in a recommendation, because very often then the student is so proud of that they'll make sure that their school counselor or one of their teachers, or they'll talk about it themselves in the additional information section. They'll elevate that. Now, I could see a student really contriving something and coming up with a whole resume that was bizarre. And I think that's what we're talking about here is again, but it would be, if I were in a school now, Mark, and my admission counselor at Brown or any other school called me and said, I'd like you just to, first of all, I wouldn't have a copy of the Student's Common App in front of me to understand how they conveyed something. And if I were asked, this is what they listed, what's your impression of this? I would not have that conversation.
For legal concerns?
No, for ethical, moral concerns. I would say I would be happy to bring the student in. Oh, this is after graduation, though. I would be happy to be in a 3-way Zoom call with the student, to stand with the student as you have this conversation. I think it's only fair to convey to the student what information in terms of verification would you like on the college level to ease your mind about this concern. But I would stand with the student. I'm a counselor.
And is it more about giving them every opportunity to avoid that, to protect them from being falsely accused of something that was just innocent?
Well, I wouldn't have seen it necessarily if I don't sit with every student's application to every college. Now, some of us who are independent college counselors might do that. I don't, but I expect them to follow my advice.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not the what would you call it? The warden of that information.
What's been so helpful for me has been the Common App Advisor portal now.
Yep.
How many years has this been in? It feels like less than 5. It's
only a couple. Yeah.
It's fantastic. So I see a PDF of everything. And one of my pet peeves is embellishment of hours. So I generally do go over everything with all my students to check their activities
Fabulous.
and talk with them. What I wouldn't have control over would be some listing of a national award or any kind of award. That stuff you just take by faith. But let's wrap this up, Susan. What should our takeaways be for families?
Well, I think the development of a mindset that has integrity is something that parents can start thinking about very early in their kids' lives. Taking responsibility in every way, age-appropriate ways. Not every child attends a school like ours, Mark, where there was restorative justice and eye-to-eye communication and building from childhood on that sense of personal responsibility and integrity. But every family can think about ways, obviously as parents, to model this. And this is truthfully for me where Varsity Blues was so disturbing, was that these were children who clearly were not raised in a family value system that honored integrity in a way that I would envision parents behaving. That's what I think the Varsity Blues exposed for all of us, was that this is business as usual for, a slice of society. We see it on TV, but we didn't necessarily know it was real. We idolize the American family, the perception of the American family. But every family parents have to decide for themselves how they're going to do it. And then they need to do it and help their kids understand where those boundaries are. And if they become uncomfortable as their kids move through the teenage years and are less under their thumb, to continue to talk, listen, read good books about ways, how to talk so your kids will listen and listen so your kids will talk, right? That changed my life. And decide where your values are, and your values as parents can't be that it's better to get in to a certain school no matter how you do it than being honest.
And I would also add that there are some schools that are beefing up their auditing process. Susan and I are in some different counselor groups, and we're hearing it from different counselors who are experiencing it in different ways. And
Yes.
So if the ethical argument isn't appealing, maybe the accountability argument is that,
Absolutely.
that this is something that colleges are having conversations about. They're trying their best to come up with different systems to catch it. And a lot of them will tell you that it was spawned by Varsity Blues. I know when I was at the conference, multiple schools said that they would be doing research and be enacting some type of policy so that this could not happen to them. So hopefully this was helpful for everybody.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's important for parents to know that the same thing is happening on the college side, that the level of accountability and integrity in the admission process is under a microscope right now. And I think that's a very positive outcome of Varsity Blues, as uncomfortable as we are with that, the exposure there and the naughtiness of families that behaved in this way. What it's doing is calling to question how colleges do business, and what has integrity and what might not. And some of it is just, it's been around for a long time. This is how we do business. But to rethink those admission practices in ways that shine a light into some of those dark corners. I think is only going to have good outcomes. And if what the integrity statements that kids sign, they need to know what they're signing in the common application and the coalition application or the institutional application. They're signing, they're vouching their truth, their integrity there. And it's such an important thing for kids to realize that when they sign that statement, this is saying to a university, this is who I am, this is my truth. And that's a very good thing.
Susan, thank you as always, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you, Mark. This has been an interesting, a challenging, and an interesting conversation. I look forward to hearing what listeners have to say about it.
Thank you. Thank you.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
Friends, last week you heard the first part. Now it's time for the second part.
And I think then what happens is like I said, back in the day, this was a PhD job, now they're getting master's levels clinicians. And, I really respect master's levels clinicians, but by the time I went into, being fully licensed, I had 6 years of clinical experience, supervised clinical experience, 3 of which were full-time. These kids have not gotten that, so then you're throwing them into this situation. They're maybe getting 1 or 2 hours of supervision a week, and the cases they are getting are really hard. I think that's a recipe for burnout. And even the smartest, most intended person is going to struggle in that situation.
So is there anything else you can think of that's positive? Because I don't want people to be like this. I'm depressed from hearing the state of things. I think what you just did there is what we like to call the manic defense, where you turn away from the negative and you just want to focus on all the good things. But I get it. I totally do. And you don't live in this world every day. Like I'm in this world 40 hours a week, more than 40 hours a week. I know.
But I do think there are some solutions that we could think about with college counseling centers. Now, one of them, I think, schools are already starting to try to do, which is to offer 24-hour therapy. And so, for instance, at Lilly School at Elon, they have timely care. And so, because they knew they had this huge wait list, they couldn't get all the people in, not even just for student mental health, like for just like health. So Lily would have strep throat. She loves to get strep throat as her hobby. And
Joy was that way too.
Yeah. And so, we'd have to she couldn't get in and she'd call me like 1 a.m, like, I've been sick. So we'd have to get that poor man in India on the phone again and, from timely care. And he would, look in her throat and be like, yeah, it looks bad, and prescribe her some antibiotics. So they're also doing that for therapists. So theoretically, and I've never tried it because I don't go to Elon, but sure. Theoretically, you can get a hold of a therapist 24/7. And now that might be something that can help, and in general, telehealth is something that can help this situation. Because for most people, telehealth they're finding it's about as effective as in-person sessions, not for everyone. So if schools could contract out some of their sessions to a telehealth provider for students who are comfortable with that, that could be one solution that they could do without having to hire, a lot more staff and pay them benefits and everything just to outsource it to a telehealth organization. Now, I would say in terms of telehealth, I think, I practice exclusively with telehealth right now. I wouldn't do it with everyone who wants, comes and wants an appointment. Some people I'm like, no, I don't think that's going to work for you. I don't know how, when you have a therapist who is worked at that campus for 20 years and they know Professor Smith and they know he's a little mean and the student comes in crying like, oh my God, came out of Professor Smith's class. Like that kind of expertise about the college, that particular college, that's a useful kind of thing. And I think you're going to lose that if your therapist is in Duluth and you're in Boston, but I guess, it's better than nothing. And, you just have to I think wonder about the continuity of care. So, you obviously you want to, if you like your therapist, you probably want to see the same therapist every time. You don't want to see a different therapist every time, because then you spend the first 30 minutes explaining what the problem was, where the person's like, what? And then, then you have 4 minutes of help, and then it's time to go on to the next therapist. So, I think that you can do that. I think that, one thing that they have suggested is that in order to make it financially feasible for colleges to do this, is to bill insurance for the sessions. Right now, it's a separate system, the college session. So it comes out of their revenue, right? They have tuition revenue. It pays for these sessions. Like they're just, they have the people on staff. It's kind of a fixed cost. But if they were able to, have licensed clinicians that they could bill insurance for, then they could recoup some of their money. Because I do think that's a legitimate use of insurance, especially if the community cannot provide, if there isn't a readily available, outpatient therapist or psychiatrist that you can find. If the school could at least recoup some of that money for seeing that patient for longer, I think that would help. And then, as was suggested, they could use federal coronavirus relief funds for mental health. And that is, I've read the call for that in several articles now. And I do think that is something, as we're shifting from testing so much and reporting, rightly or wrongly, it would be great to use that money to beef up mental health support for students.
Is there anything a parent, or student can do that you recommend to maybe evaluate one option versus another? Because, our people that are listening are like, my kid has got to go to college somewhere.
Yeah.
So I agree with you. This is a concern. I could see someone thinking, I'm not really sure what to do with this knowledge in terms of, you know what I mean? So
absolutely.
Yeah.
And so,
is that the manic defense again?
No,
Okay.
You are, but you're not sitting with your feelings here, buddy. You're like going straight to action, But so maybe it is a teeny bit.
Teeny bit, yeah.
One other thing I was going to say is that I think, just in terms of the money, and then I'll get to what parents can do, is that I think that schools should try to get donors who donate specifically for mental health issues. There are people out there who, want to donate to schools. Mackenzie Scott, I'm looking at you.
Never know who listens to our podcast.
If you're listening, you could spread some of that wealth around to those student mental health centers. You'd be making a big difference in so many people's lives. Because if you don't prioritize mental health for your student body, bad things are going to happen, because mental health is contagious in a way. If you're around a lot of stressed out, upset people, you can't help but just feel upset yourself. And if people are killing themselves and they're overdosing in your dorm, it's very unsettling, and you feel kind of unsafe, and you sort of switch into survival mode. And it's hard to learn when you're in survival mode and you're kind of panicked. So I think it's really important for education that we have schools be as calm and as, healthy mentally as possible. So what I would say, and part of this is just even doing my research for this bonus content, is if you want to find out more about how it's going at health services, check the student newspapers of each institution. Most of them are online. You can put in the keyword mental health, student health, and you will come up with a plethora of articles. And if you have a bunch of them, like from a school saying, their wait list is 9 months, or we're investigating this, or somebody is complaining, or this, you're seeing all that, like there was an attempted suicide in the, the Brown dorm last night. That's a red flag, right? And that's something that warrants investigation.
I like your question about wait lists, because that's a real tangible way of comparing different schools. Like, what's the wait list like? That's something to even to talk to students, or if you're in like a parent Facebook group, talking to parents, getting a parent perspective, getting a student perspective, as well as what the school's sort of party line is on that.
Right. And I think that Facebook group is a great idea. Because I think people are more honest about this, and they feel like they can talk about it more and check with the student organizations. Like, your student can email, like if there's an association of students with, mental illness on campus, and there are, ask them, like, how's it going with that counseling center, and then certainly I definitely think calling up, talking to the director of the counseling center as a parent, saying like, what's your session limit? How many people are on staff? What's their level of training? What are their licensures? Do you have a psychiatrist that they can see if they need like, antidepressants or ADD meds? And just to really kind of grill each school on it. And I think you're going to see there's going to be a big variance in what you're going to find. And then also, if you've selected a college now, so it's, June, you've selected a college now, and that you are going to need to have some mental health treatment. And I think that's great if you're doing that because you're proactive and you're taking care of yourself. And I applaud that. But if you know that, you need to start getting on an appointment now for August or September, because that's how long you're going to be waiting. And you need to start calling around. And if you can see that person, if their licensure allows it, via telehealth now to establish a relationship over the summer, I would highly recommend that you do that so that when you get to school, that's not the next new thing that you're doing. You've already got a solid person that you're working with. Now, sometimes people want to, take their therapist to school with them or take their psychiatrist to school with them, which can really be great. If you have someone you have a great relationship with, they know you, but you have to really keep licensure in mind. So that is, it is a big inefficiency in our country that every state has different rules. And, in order to keep doing telehealth with your providers, either they have to have some kind of access to do telehealth in your state, or I think, you just kind of never mention where you are when you have those sessions, and you always use your home address back with your parents so that therapist is never liable for not violating their licensure. And different professions have different flexibility. So I'm a psychologist, and psychology, we are terrible at advocating for ourselves normally, but the one decent thing that I've seen us do is we have been advocating for something called PsyPact. So it's if you have a license in one of like these 32 states and it keeps increasing, then you can practice telehealth in all of the states. So like someone will call me up and say, Lisa, can you do an evaluation for this person in Texas? And I'll say, gee, I don't know. Let me check. I'm like, turns out I can. Whereas, before the pandemic, no, of course I couldn't do that evaluation. It's a much more efficient distribution of therapists. And I think master's level clinicians and social workers are starting to move more to that model. So hopefully that will start to ease some of this problem, because we have lots of therapists concentrated in certain areas and zero therapists concentrated in other areas, and it could spread that out. But my main thing is to get on the ball, people, and get those therapists, get your treatment figured out now while you can, because in the fall, that's when therapists book up anyway. Like October, like that's when everyone goes back to school and the problem starts. So between October and January, we call that money time. And that's when you build up your caseload for the year. And so they're going to be getting lots of calls then, and you want to be first in line.
No, that's all great stuff. I just thought of something. Couldn't one other thing families do be try to enhance their own personal medical coverage to have expanded mental health?
That would be a great thing to do, but man, it's hard to do. Now, sometimes people have a choice.
Okay.
So my husband's company has like 3 policies you can pick from, but some companies just have, it's the policy,
I'll see.
And then if you're trying to buy insurance on the exchange, like it can be very difficult to get something. Mostly what's available is high deductible plans.
Is there stuff out there like, you always see this advertised about Medicare, where like buy supplemental coverage because it doesn't cover everything. Is there anything like that where you can get
There's not like that for people who are under 65, to my knowledge.
Okay, so there's not like a supplemental mental health,
but it's so expensive. It'd be easier just to pay out of pocket. Quite honestly.
Okay.
I wish that were the case. I mean, honestly, the crisis here is really about healthcare in general, and how like randomly healthcare is like assigned to people depending on what company you work for or where you live or, how much money you make. It's like, it's not equitable and it's not universally available. And I think until we have that, you're going to see crazy things going on with the system. And I really do feel like the colleges are caught in the middle. Like it's like a tsunami and they don't have any kind of, storm wall at this point.
Well, this has been great, Lisa. Thank you for that. I think you gave a thorough analysis of the problem, and you also gave some really practical solutions and advice for people to how to assess. Because I think that piece is really, really important. I think to our listeners, 'cause I think a lot of people know that it's a problem. Maybe they haven't experienced it, but they believe it, but they're like, my kid has to go to college somewhere, so what do I do? And so I think some of those practical things are good for people to know what to actually do or how to evaluate and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I don't mean to be depressing or provide, sad information, but I do think that knowledge is power. And I do
Sure.
think even if your kid does not have a mental health issue and won't have a mental health issue, it is in your best interest to send your child to an institution that has robust mental health care available, because what happens to one person affects all of us. I mean, I don't think people always recognize that if your roommate is having a mental health issue, that is going to be hard for you if your roommate is not treated, for instance. So it's in everyone's best interest to ask colleges about this, to advocate for this, in whatever ways that you can, to try to make sure that that is available to all students who need it.
Thank you. And I'm glad you kind of really reiterated sort of the contagious aspect. And I think the roommate really makes it kind of really hit home. Like, yeah, you want a roommate? Then even if you're thinking, well, I think my kid may be okay. I mean, not to say they will be, but if that's your mindset, it doesn't mean the roommate is, and then the contagious effect of the roommate. So,
well, exactly. And then the roommate is stressing you out. And then all of a sudden, wow, you're anxious because you're afraid that guy is going to kill you. I mean, and it just goes on and on. And I think that just in general, in education, people don't realize how the problems of one set of kids, it affects the experience of everyone. And that's why we need to make sure that everyone gets what they need. That's my personal.
I'm conscious of that because when we did boarding school admissions, if anyone has seen a psychologist at all for any reason in the last 2 years, they had to fill out a special form, relinquish consent. We had to get a full cycle evaluation from the psychologist or psychiatrist, partly to see if we could serve that kid. But some of it also was to see if they were going to be a risk to other people that they were going to be living with.
Right. And, I'm a huge supporter of therapy. I really think, and I'm not just saying this because I made money off of it for my career. I really think everybody could use therapy. Like, it's great to have someone to talk to and better understand yourself and get ideas and bounce things off of. And, so I'm evaluating someone, let's say, to be like an egg donor or surrogate, and they say they went to therapy. I don't ding them immediately. I just ask why. And if it's like, well, because I had these relationship issues and
Sure.
I realized I was always running away from boyfriends and I wanted to fix it, then I'm like, you get an A+, girl, so it's not like getting treatment is a sign of problem. It's, not having available treatment that is the problem, I think.
Well, the good thing is that this younger generation seems to understand that much more so.
I think that's really good. Hopefully they will, fix some of the wrongs that they have unintentionally experienced, and
sins of the parents
into the sunset. Well, it's not even sins of the parents at this point. I think it's like just the sins of society, really. But that's probably a whole nother podcast. So,
well, thank you, Lisa. Thank you very much. See you next week.
All right.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, last week you heard the first part of our interview. Now it's time for the second part. I know you've touched on merit scholarships, and you guys have been proven to be quite generous there. But this is probably a good place to also talk about tuition reset that you also had. For anybody who's not familiar with that term, I'll let you explain it. But it's sort of an acknowledgement that you realized that seeing the sticker price was a hurdle for some people even considering it. So why don't you explain what a tuition reset is and how that applied to Willamette and why you chose to do it?
Yeah, no, I'm so glad you brought that up, Mark, because this is a bold step for Willamette. One of the other, I think, myths that we struggle with in private college education is this idea that price equals prestige or cost equals quality. I think people, that concept is out there in the world for anything that you purchase, right? The more expensive, the better it must be, right?
Yeah.
I think that's untrue of lots of things out there in the world, and it certainly is untrue of college education. We we see a game happening where if the market is perceiving that the price point is what makes you valuable, then everybody's looking at what everybody else is doing and saying, well, if their tuition has gone to this point, we better raise ours too. And it's this impossible trajectory
Sure.
of rising costs. And so Willamette is one of, I would say, a handful of places in recent years that has just said, you know what, we're confident enough in who
Hmm.
we are as an institution and in our outcomes and in our programs and success stories that we're just going to get out of that game and we're going to reset our tuition by 20%. So we just said we're going to stop worrying about people equating cost with quality. We're going to stand on our tradition of quality and set our tuition back. And we did that starting just last year. And it means that, well, and it happened in a really different, really interesting time. So we set our tuition back in the midst of a pandemic when we knew people needed,
Sure.
some relief from this idea of these huge sticker prices. And at the same time, we saw a record-breaking year of alumni giving, which was a really amazing thing. And again, in the midst of a pandemic, Willamette alumni stepped up and said, we're going to give like we've never given before. That combination of things means that our overall costs are less than many of our peers. And we're able, because of that alumni giving, to give bigger merit scholarships than we were giving before. So now when students are admitted to Willamette, they're going to see right off the top a 45 to 70% discount on tuition because of their merit scholarship award. So again, it goes back to that idea that is this incredible kind of education too expensive? Not for a lot of people, and particularly not given this reset and the merit increases. This is helping. It's helping all of our students across the board. It's particularly helping those families who fall in the middle, who have been the families that I think we've had the biggest trouble helping in the past. Willamette's done a really good job in recent years of helping students on the lower end of the economic spectrum. We've had lots of access programs for them. But we've struggled with those families who you mentioned earlier, who'd fall short of receiving state or federal aid, but certainly don't have the full amount to send off to Willamette every year. This reset combined with the merit awards is really addressing that group in a way that's super exciting because we don't want students to have to make their college choice based solely on price, right? We want them to
Sure.
choose the experience that's right for them.
I really appreciate how you were transparent with this association of cost with quality and how so many people, including you at one time, were kind of playing that game and fearful of the messaging it would send. And then deciding, you know what, we're just going to get off of that race and do our own thing. And, I talked to Dean of Admission at Roanoke College, which recently made this change in Virginia, and they could not be happier as well with the tuition reset. So I always like it when people feel like, we're not going to be in a herd mentality. We're going to do what we think is the right thing. And it's nice to know it's working well for you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, Willamette sort of has a part of our persona really is around leadership. And I can talk about that more at some point when we talk specifically about Willamette. But this reset and this kind of boldly stepping into the conversation about tuition feels like an important place to try to lead.
Awesome. Well, this was the one I really want to talk to you about. So this is a third myth, and the last one we'll tackle for the day. Institutional quality is best gauged by admit rate, price, which we've talked about that, and rankings. So let's talk about institutional quality is best gauged by acceptance rate and rankings.
Yeah.
I could almost throw test scores in as another one, right? That's a common myth in there as well.
Absolutely. It's so interesting how we've gotten to this point in higher ed where we get so wrapped up in the numbers. And even those of us who have worked in this field for many, many years and know without question that, the numbers tell us one thing, but we're talking about young human beings here who have such incredible value as people. And there's so much behind an application and behind this process that is not about numbers. It's not quantifiable. It can't be ranked. So it's a strange thing that we fall into this camp of being such a high touch, personalized process, and at the same time have kind of gotten ourselves into the situation where we have to worry so much about or think so much about the numbers. But the one that really I probably struggle with the most is this idea of admit rate, and how people, families who are college searching, will get focused on this idea, kind of like price that we were talking about a few minutes ago, that it is the admit rate that determines or reflects the quality of a student's experience or overall education. And that if a place is able to deny, name the number, 90%, 95%, 80% of their applicants, that somehow means it's a quality experience. It might, they might correlate. Lots of really great places are under great demand and have to say no to a lot of their applicants. That's certainly true. But there are also a lot of really great places that produce really incredibly impactful people and terrific outcomes for their alumni that have an admit rate that's well over 50%. They get to say yes a lot. And one of the main reasons is because many of those places are not trying to be in the game of being very worried about that admit rate. So I would contend, and I would be happy to have a conversation about this with any number of my colleagues, but I would contend that admit rate is one of the most easily manipulated numbers in the admission.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
Friends, the recommended resource is one I probably should have shared a couple years ago, and it's the website collegefactual.com. It's just a fantastic resource. Now, I've given you many, many resources that are what I call data galore. Every imaginable piece of data you could ever want there, from outcomes data to college majors to all the stats. And what I tell my students is I want you to expose yourself, and I have about 8 different websites I share with them. And I don't need you to work with all of them, but I want you to be familiar with all of them. And then some of them are just more appealing to different people because of their aesthetic nature, how visual they are, how their eye works. And this is one of those resources, so you've heard me mention, I'm not going to mention them all, but some of the others I've mentioned are like Data USA, College Navigator, College Data, Big Future, Niche, CapEx. These comprehensive websites like College Factual are foundational in your search. And this is one you should be exposed to. I like it. It appeals to my eye, so I use it regularly. Check it out and see if it works for you. collegefactual.com. It's our recommended resource for episode 237. Now return to my interview with Sue Corner. So this is what I really want you to talk about for our listeners. Can you share some of the ways, you don't have to name schools, but I know you probably have them in your mind, that you've seen admit rate manipulated?
So the admit rate is you have so many applications and you say yes or no to so many within that pool, based historically on how many you think will come if you say yes, right? If we say yes to 50% of our applicants, that's more than we can actually enroll, but we know that 20% of those we say yes to will actually ultimately enroll. It's a big kind of imprecise science. If you want to lower your admit rate, the easiest way to do that is simply to grow your applicant pool, to have more that you just then can turn around and say no to some. And the way that we grow our applicant pool is to buy, or we now say license, more names. Colleges all get names from the SAT or the ACT or other
Sure.
sources. And we can choose who those names are. We use parameters, right, to solicit names that we think might be a good fit for our institution. So, for instance, at Willamette, when we're working with the folks at SAT to tap into some of those test takers, we say we'd like to start communicating with those who have a B plus average or higher GPA, because that's the kind of student that generally can succeed at Willamette. Well, we could start searching for anybody with a C average and above,
Sure.
and solicit applications from those students, woo them into applying, grow our number, just to turn around them then and say no to a good
Recruiting
portion
to
of them.
reject, as they call, right?
Exactly.
Recruiting to reject.
Exactly. Yeah. Lots of places play that game. And so this idea that somehow admit rate is this pure number that speaks entirely to the quality and popularity of a place for reasons that really have true meaning, just to me is a false reality. It scares me when people are making decisions about where they want to apply or where they want to enroll based on that number. It simply doesn't have anything to do with how you measure the quality of a place.
And I can tell you, Sue, it happens. Like I see it on my counseling side all the time. I'll see people categorize schools by admit rates. I'll see myself give schools to students and families, and they'll tell me that admit rate's too high. I can see that's a prism they're looking through. In fact, I've often said, I feel there's almost like 4 ways that people judge schools, like in terms of bracketing them. One is admit rate, one is rankings, one is average test scores, and the fourth is just what do people say is if I throw the name out into social circles, what reaction do I get? And I see how this plays itself out all the time on this admit rate thing. And, for the longest time, I was really struggling, and I still somewhat am struggling with the fact that why is there such a disconnect between schools that students think they can get in versus where they can get in? Because when you do what I do, majority of the time people come to you with very top-heavy lists. And a lot of what you're having to do is to reset expectations. And, part of it I attributed to, well, things have changed a lot, and parents think of certain schools back when they went as not being that hard to get in, and they can't believe how much they've changed. And so that somewhat partially explains it, and I get it. But one thing that just really hit me, it's hit me for a while, but it's really hit me this year more than any other time, and that is all the college mail that students get. The college mail that they get from schools where I know from doing this, they're highly unlikely to be admitted at. And then, I just had a parent say to me, as someone I just started working with, haven't even built a college list for this family yet. And they said, would you like to know all of the schools that are recruiting him really hard? And I said, by that, do you mean sending mail? Yes. And so that's the interpretation, right? But I see schools that send mail to people way out of their profile of who they would admit. And that drums up interest. And then they think they're being recruited. And it's made me a lot more sympathetic to understanding why so often people are coming with really top-heavy lists. If you're getting all of this mail, and the school if it is a school that's changed its selectivity quite a bit from the time parents went, the combination of those two factors makes some sense. And so I'm really glad you touched on that a school you could target C students with your mailers, and you could even have mailers that could talk about, we are so excited about you, and talk about merit scholarships and things that could drum up their interest, that could translate them into highly likely to apply, only to deny them, right? And that's kind of how the game is played out there.
It is. Well, and even for those who aren't trying to falsely inflate the our pool or deflate that admit rate. Just the rise in technology and the way that we use technology to communicate has changed so much in the last generation. The parents who are, my peers who are seeing students through this process right now had an entirely different process. Like you said, places have become more selective, and certainly the way students are communicated with is just entirely different. There's so much noise, and we do everything in this mass way. We email. So even those of us who aren't trying to be in that game, we're still emailing some students to say, please apply. We want to
Sure.
interact with you. We're always going to have some of that.
Nothing's wrong with reaching out. It's, I think, if you're targeting people that are highly unlikely to be admitted, and you're giving them the impression that they have a good chance, that's the part that I was addressing, not the outreach. Yeah.
No, I agree. But the point being, how much of your of the pool that you're reaching out to falls into that category of actually not being admissible, and that's very easily manipulated, and really confusing to families.
Sure. And here's another thing: there's not even a standard definition of an application, right? So a school could have a very minimal commitment for someone to complete something, and they could put that into their application numbers and run that into their formulas.
Exactly. Well, and that plays into this idea of rankings too. The definitions and the way we all report things, there are some things that are standardized. There are many things that are not. And so, yes, one institution may be counting some very minimal hand raising that a prospective student does, and they'll count that as an applicant, versus another place that says, no, we need to have a fully completed application with all of its components for a student to count as an applicant. So that number is can vary widely. And then when these groups are looking to rank institutions, U.S. News is obviously the biggie that people pay attention to. U.S. News, and we all have a love-hate relationship, I think, with U.S. News. It's always interesting to see where we land. It's kind of exciting to see what has changed from year to year. And yet we know that behind the scenes, we've all independently provided the information to U.S. News that they're asking for. There's nobody who's checking necessarily that what we're reporting is consistently being counted in the way our neighbor is reporting it. So one place may say, well, our alumni giving looks like this, and that gets calculated into their ranking rubric, that gets counted in a way that then hurts the way we're ranked because we've counted our alumni giving in a different way. Do you know what I mean?
Sure.
There is not an absolute standard for so many of the things that are calculated into those rankings that you just can't be certain that it's an apples to apples game at all.
The sad part for me is a lot of the gimmickry that we're talking about. I actually feel it kind of works. The sad part, like if a school's acceptance rate starts dropping, it's going to lead to more applications because the public is making inferences about that. And then, of course, the school is also touting that too, right? It's not just that. They're touting record-breaking year, blah, blah, blah. And so there's like, oh, it's the hot school. Look at the momentum. What's going on? I like the buzz. The reason why this is so prevalent is because it actually can work a lot of times. I mean, obviously, your whole thing can come down like a deck of cards if you don't have something to back it up and some substance, but it certainly can get more people signing up for info sessions and saying, I'll go visit the place and give it a look.
Yep. And that's why I say we have a love-hate relationship with some of this. We sort of feel like we have to participate. Sure. Because yes, it is one way that we get attention. And I know what an incredible experience people have here at Willamette. So I want to draw attention to this place in any way that I can so that people will experience and know about it. And if rankings is one of those ways, then yes, we're going to participate in that. And yet I understand that at its core, I don't think this is the way that you should choose a college experience. I really don't think these rankings are truly relevant to what is the best fit or the best way to understand an institution. When you're making this incredibly important life decision.
So, Sue, let's close out with, this is going to be a difficult task because you said it earlier. It's very confusing for students and parents. And that's my question. Like, what's your advice for students and parents to sift through the morass of all of this to figure out what numbers can be trusted and not trusted when there's so much gimmickry?
Yeah. I mean, I think first and foremost, and I've said this at lots of, college nights for different schools, and I think sometimes it makes people very uncomfortable, but I think we have to shut out the noise of other parents, of students who are saying to other students, oh, that's not a good enough place to apply to. This noise around what is and what is not a place worth looking at, a college worth considering. We've got to stop thinking about places only in terms of these rankings and numbers and really look at some of the more tangible pieces. It's more work to try to dig into what truly is the caliber of the faculty and how do they relate to and interact with undergraduate students. What are the outcomes of a place? What are the alumni going on to do, and what kind of impact do they have, in the world and in their workplace and in their family? What are the resources available for students in terms of accessing that next step? What are their career resources? How are students being helped to determine what their next step is? These are the things that people need to dig into to understand a place. It's easy to think just about the numbers or rest just on names that are familiar. It's much more bold and it is more work, but to look into those places that may be lesser known, but are actually the experience that's going to be successful for you or for your child. And that's ultimately what we want, right? Is for these students to thrive and to stay and to complete and to have a college experience that's life-changing. And that's not based on rankings in a book. It's based on the quality of the actual experience and the people. So I think digging into that is what people have to do.
And that's a drop the mic moment. We'll close with that because you got a good fourth myth in there, which is, if it was any good, I would have heard of it, right? Because that's the other thing where people oftentimes may know schools by ESPN or something like that, or they might know the schools locally to them.
Right.
But it is very risky to assume I haven't heard of it, it can't be any good, especially if it's a school that is significant distance from where you live. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Exactly. Great. Well, you ready to come back next week and talk about Willamette?
I would love it. Thanks so much for having me, Mark.
Oh, this has been a blast.
And now it's time for our College Spotlight of the Week.
Friends, last week you heard the first part of our interview. Now it's time for the second part. Why don't you walk us through just the range of community colleges that are out there and the differences? Because, in listening to you on some previous podcasts you've been on, I was learning things I didn't know about. Like, you're talking about community colleges that have football teams. I'm like, community colleges that have dorms. I mean, there's just a range out there.
There is. So the community college is about as diverse as our country is, Mark. And so what's interesting is there are very small and important community colleges in rural parts of our country that maybe only have 1,000 students or so, but they focus on serving the needs of a really specific community. And then some of the largest institutions of higher education in this country are community colleges. You take a look at Miami-Dade College, in which I think, I haven't checked their enrollment, but it's close to six figures. It's maybe 100,000 students. You've got mega community colleges. We're a mid-sized community college in the range of about 10,000 students, but we come in all shapes and sizes. And you're exactly right. There are parts of the country that have residence life, that have dorms. There community college athletics are a big deal. We have an excellent basketball program where I was at, and track and field, and I'll leave somebody out. I apologize.
Sure.
I was president of the community college in Toledo, Ohio. We were, back-to-back national championships in women's volleyball. And athletics are an important part of many community colleges. Some of them don't have them at all. So there's quite a range of what you see. But the common denominator that runs through all 1,100 or so community colleges is this incredibly special localness. We are designed to meet the higher ed and workforce needs of the communities where we serve. Here at Lansing Community College, we're one of 28 great community colleges in Michigan, but we're built to respond to the needs of mid-Michigan and the capital city. Lansing is the capital of Michigan. So this is something we've been doing since the late 50s, and this story is repeated everywhere. Your listeners who are interested in higher ed but don't know about their community college, my challenge to them would be find out what the community college is that's close to you. There are pockets of this country particularly the rural areas, where if you're going to see a live musical performance or a play, it's going to happen at the community college or it doesn't happen at all.
Yeah, and another thing that I notice is that while we talk about the stigma, I notice that the stigma is not consistent from state to state. There are states where I will hear many people say, I think I'm going to go to the community college, not because it's my only option, but because it's my best option. And those tend to be states where they've got these really good vertical transfer articulation agreements in place. Can you, first of all, tell our listeners what an articulation agreement is, but then also, can you sort of give us a lay of the land nationally, like who's doing really, really well with their community college partnerships? And anything you want to shed on that to sort of give us the national picture, because as somebody who's in Georgia, I noticed that we do not have some of the things I'm seeing in other states.
Well, I love the question. I approach it with a little trepidation because I think I'll probably leave some great folks out. It's tough. But you asked to define articulation agreements. So this is what I would call, transfer 1.0. This is just the basics, making sure that the community college credits that are taken align well with a degree path at a 4-year destination. But to me, that's the minimum, because the research on this is not great, Mark. There's a lot of credit loss between community college transfer students. And, there's a lot of actually cutting edge research now about how to minimize it. So, for example, as a national best practice, I'll shout out a couple of national organizations. I'm a big fan of the Aspen Institute. The Aspen Institute is doing a lot of great work in the community college area. In 2012, they launched a $1 million prize when President Obama was putting a great focus on community colleges. Every 2 years, they award and name the best community college in the country, and with a $1 million prize. That inaugural year, it was Valencia College in Florida. They're one of those examples of great transfer pathways. Another one that comes to mind is what happens in Virginia with NOVA, with Northern Virginia Community College, and great relationships with George Mason University. There are pockets of this happening all over the country. I would also give a shout out to Achieving the Dream, which has done a lot of great work on transfer. Skipping back to Aspen, there's a transfer playbook, which is in large part a collaboration with the Community College Research Center at Columbia University, taking a data-driven approach for what works for credit momentum for community college students. Interestingly enough, one of the biggest data points or findings of the community college transfer research is that the best thing you can do as a community college student to make sure that you transfer with momentum is build a relationship with somebody at the transfer destination. I know folks in your line of work would say, oh, of course, that makes complete sense. But to be intentional about transfer and these agreements that are bigger than articulation, bigger than 2+2, are designed to be seamless pathways. So we eliminate these barriers for transfer students.
Talk to me about North Carolina and California, because these are some of the states where I hear really positive momentum for community colleges. And I know there are others too, but I'm just telling you what I hear a lot of.
Well, and you're onto something, and I told you I would leave somebody out. So let's start with North Carolina. There are, I think, 58, like a very large number of community colleges in North Carolina. I have colleagues in that system and actually spoken to that community college system group. They function in many ways as a state system, and they've been leaders in a lot of things. In the 80s, they were much out ahead of workforce development, and right now they are leaders in transfer. And one of the things about California community colleges, there are an insane number of community colleges in California, and it's a really well developed infrastructure. And what you will see is students identifying with a state university destination while they're at their local community college. There's something happening in California, Mark, that I have as kind of a vision for where we might go as a country. And that is, I would really love to see community college experience on somebody's resume or on their transcript seen as a positive. When somebody looks at that and says, wow, if this person started at a community college, they must have been an enterprising person who made things happen for themselves, and they were in an environment where there's a heterogeneous group of learners, diverse set of experiences. I can see community college experience on your college transcript being a positive differentiator. And that's actually what I tell students at our graduation. I say, look, please continue to tell your community college story when you go on and do the great things you're going to do in your life.
No, that's absolutely priceless. I really appreciate you. I really appreciate you saying that. How can a parent or a student evaluate community colleges? Like I can see a lot of our listeners like intrigued now. Their appetite is whetted, and they would like to learn a little bit more. Because one thing about us, we try to pride ourselves on as being a podcast that isn't focusing only on the most selective schools.
Right.
There are plenty of others that are all about trying to get to Harvard, and we try not to be that podcast.
Right.
So we're trying to cover, the full, educational spectrum. How can a family evaluate the community college? What do you recommend? Let's say you've got a couple choices. Like what would you say? Either sources of data or on-site visits. I mean, coach our families on how to evaluate the community college.
Well, thanks for the question. And you actually framed it the way I wanted to. Let's do a data or internet approach and an in-person approach. And let's start with in-person, because I said it and I meant it. One of our community colleges have localness as a huge differentiator. Now, your listeners and families with prospective college students might live proximate to some of the institutions that they're looking at, but maybe those places are a few hours away. One of the great things about the community college is it is very likely right there. It's probably been under your nose the whole time. If you're in a community where there's strong K-12 partnerships, maybe your students already had experiences with the community college, because in many states, the dual enrollment programs are led by community colleges because the partnerships are so strong between K-12 and community college. But my first piece of advice would be to go there. Look and see if there are cultural opportunities like plays, musical performances, things happening with the community college as the backdrop for the event. But also, community colleges also do campus visits, and they also have walk-in student success centers. If anyone was listening here in Lansing, I'd invite them to stop by and come to the Star Zone, which is our one-stop shop for student success here for enrollment and academic advising and student success. And community colleges are great places in addition to being wonderful institutions. So that would be my recommendation. See if there's a college visit or campus tour, or just pop by the local community college. And it is very likely you'll be surprised. I can't tell you how many friends of mine or folks who are not in higher ed, they'll come and visit me and they'll say, oh, this is like a real college. And I'll say, of course it's like a real college. In fact,
What
Mark,
were you expecting?
yeah, I know. And I'll tell you this, Mark. So you and I, we're both Spartans.
Sure.
I loved being in East Lansing. I loved living in the dorms at MSU. But if I had it to do over again, I think I would have done my first 2 years here at LCC because I loved Lansing.
Right.
But we're downtown.
Sure.
East Lansing is kind of a suburb. We're
Sure.
in a vibrant downtown with cool restaurants, great things to do. And I can see as an 18 to 20-year-old, maybe feeling even like I fit in more here at the community college and still have the great trajectory of finishing up junior, senior year at the state university. So that's the visit. Now on the data evaluation, you actually gave a caveat of something that I think we should take with a grain of salt. Some of the success measures you see at a community college, and I want to be really careful about this. This is not an excuse. I think we should be held to high standards. There's a lot of rigor and great high standards at community colleges, but because we are an open door, because we accept everyone, it will not be an apples to apples comparison to take a look at graduation rate or time to graduation in comparison to other schools. So that's thing number one. And then a good comprehensive community college will have a robust website where you can explore things like co-curricular, extracurricular activities, athletics, the other things that are going on at the community college. Then these are the things I know because I've listened to your podcast that you coach parents and families to evaluate and kick the tires of these institutions by looking at their strategic plan and the other things they have going on. So do all of those also.
And if somebody wants to find out sort of outcomes data, like what happens to people after they leave, is there a similar kind of contact department or person to talk to at most community colleges to get that kind of data?
Absolutely. So, I mean, in one episode of your podcast, I was listening to intently when you all were recommending finding the institutional research page at a community college. Most community colleges will have an IR department. That made me really happy, by the way, when you said that, because I led an IR department for many years.
Oh,
good. It's important. It's important work.
Yeah, and it's something most people don't even know exists.
Mm-hmm. So there are those student success measures, and the other thing you can do is, and I mentioned a couple of these institutions, but of these national organizations, but let me bring up these two again. Take a look at the community colleges that have been in contention for the Aspen Prize. So basically, this is how the prize works, based on data outcomes of student success and workforce value, folks who go out and do well after college. The Aspen Institute selects 120 of the 1,100 community colleges every other year to be eligible for the prize. That's a great list, and then they narrow it down to a top 10. I was the first year of the prize, and that's when I was leading an IR department. We were in 2012. I was at another community college, Mott Community College in Flint, Michigan. We made the top 10 that year, based on objective data measurement.
They've got some good sports.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yep, absolutely. In fact, my office overlooked the field house at when I was at Mott. I was there for a long time. But so the Aspen colleges are very good. But I also mentioned another student success initiative called Achieving the Dream, which is very focused on two-year colleges. And they have some recognition of excellent community colleges, the Leah Meyer Austin Award. There are a lot of community colleges that are really doing exceptional things with student success. And they get recognized by groups like Aspen and ATD. And the national organizations like the American Association of Community Colleges.
So how would somebody find this Aspen list? Is there a website or
So I mean, I should Google it right now, but all the lists are out there, I think it's aspeninstitute.org. They have it's a college excellence program, and in addition to the prize, they also train community college presidents. I'm a proud fellow, Aspen fellow. And they designed that curriculum with Stanford. So we were with the fellows, we started at Stanford, and then went to Virginia and finished in Aspen, Colorado, where the institute is. And their goal is to diversify and grow the cadre of community college presidents.
Nice.
So I'm a proud grad of that program from cohort 2, the second year. Aspen Institute and these other organizations, they do a great job of ranking community colleges.
Great. So about to wind down here, and nobody gets away without getting off the hot seat, as you know.
Hot seat.
But before we do, is there anything about community colleges that you haven't shared that you want to share?
I would just say, knowing the listener of your great podcast, it is a great podcast. Every family who has a prospective college student, they all want the best for their college student. And I have 2 kids in college right now, and it can be all consuming. You want to make sure that this very pivotal choice is done correctly, and that your young person gets the experience, that formative experience. I would say, don't overlook your local community college. Have a look at it with your own eyes and think of it in the trajectory of the entire higher education experience your young person is going to have. There's a chance that the bachelor's degree might not be the only degree that your student is looking for. And while it might not have been top of mind when you started saving for college or thinking about college for your young person, there is a chance. And one of a member of my extended family, prominent surgeon in town, high-flying student, decided to come here to LCC as opposed to many other options for some very specific reasons along the lines that we talked about, with small class size, great opportunities. So give your local community college a good look and put it alongside these other institutions that you're looking at. That's what I would say.
One thing that we've touched on it, but I think our listeners might be surprised that there's some colleges out there that are literally like prioritizing community college transfers, partly as a type of diversity, and partly because, particularly if maybe they're coming from a place that hasn't been residential, they see themselves as maybe being able to make a difference in that person's life in a different kind of way than if maybe they're coming from a competitive 4-year institution as a residential transfer. And so, because that's one thing that schools look at is not only how can you impact us, but how can we impact you? And so it can actually be a hook, what we call a hook in admissions, to be coming from a community college in certain instances to selective colleges. And I think that might be surprising to some people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the students, I write letters of recommendation for our transfer students all the time. And a student from last year, full ride to Michigan, because of the background that he had and the way he started at a community college. And to me, I see more of that happening. You can just Google it, right? And the Ivies are looking at community college transfer students.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. All right. Somebody comes to Lansing. They could be visiting you, Michigan State. What restaurant do they go to? What's your recommendation?
We'd have some important. If they're like me and they like junk food, I would take them to a couple of places. You might remember El Azteco from our college days, one of the best Mexican restaurants around here. There's one in East Lansing. There's one here. But there's also this amazing little hamburger joint that has called Cupie downtown.
Oh, nice.
And so that might be a place. If they wanted something, we'd have to have a different conversation if they wanted a more fine dining experience. But
do they still have that restaurant that's kind of like you're in a train?
Yes. Well, it's that you're thinking of a place called Clara's.
Yes. That used to be. I used to love going there.
So Clara's is being redeveloped by a local developer. It's a historic building. Your listeners will have to picture it. It's a railroad depot. It's got a real 19th century look to it, and there is
Really
a
does.
rail car there. In the pandemic, the restaurant didn't stay open, but it's being redeveloped, and I think it won't stay a full-fledged restaurant, but that building will have a cool development, maybe like a cafe as part of it. It's a prominent part of downtown.
Cool. All right, Steve. Somebody says you can go to any concert you want to. It's on me. Music concert. Who you gonna go hear?
Geez, does the artist have to be alive? Or can I time travel?
We'll let you time travel.
So I would see Miles Davis again. I'm a huge jazz fanatic. I minored in music in college, and I was fortunate to see Miles Davis and his band, and a number of times, but not enough. Maybe I would like to catch him earlier. He was mostly playing fusion and rock and roll when I saw him, and that was amazing shows. But I might travel back and see him at Birdland or the Village Vanguard in the early '60s.
Good stuff. I'm gonna let you time travel on this as well. Famous person, alive or dead, that you could spend an hour with.
Oh, geez. These lock my radar because I have so many. I think, going back, it would, I think I would choose Maya Angelou, and I'll tell you why. And there's a Michigan State connection here. Probably the most powerful in-person oratory experience I've ever had was a speech she gave at the Wharton Center at Michigan State.
Nice.
If somebody pulled me out of the audience and said, "You get to spend an hour with Miss Angela," I that might be it. Even though our lives overlapped,
Sure,
I'm not traveling back hundreds of years.
It's okay.
But that would be really impactful for me.
Good stuff. What's the one thing on your bucket list you hope to do before you pass on?
I think I'd like to get a chair in a community orchestra in the bass section. I minored in double bass, and I'm okay, but I'm not great. But late career, or maybe after I retire, I think it'd be fun to play in an orchestra.
Cool. Your favorite sport to watch?
I like basketball.
Oh, now I know you got the green and white in the blood. Although football is coming on strong. We finished 8th in the country this year.
Yeah. Sparty didn't have a great year, but good game last night.
Yeah. We needed that one. Definitely. A book you've read that's had a big impact on you in the last 5 years?
Last 5 years, I've read so many. The one that I'm going to select is one that I would recommend particularly to white leaders in higher education, and that is a book called Black Fatigue. And I wish I had it in front of me, but with our focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think particularly white, male, straight, cisgender leaders need to spend a lot of time not only working on allyship, but filling an empathy gap that we have. And Black Fatigue was a book about this experience of just how ongoing and difficult racism is, in a way that it's hard to appreciate if you haven't experienced it. So I could strongly recommend that book.
Thank you for that, Steve. I much appreciate it. And finally, advice for parents who are our main listeners. What advice would you give to a parent out here listening?
Well, parents who are engaged in college searches, right?
Sure.
That's
That's
specifically
our
what we're
listenership.
talking about. Yeah.
Yeah.
So one thing, and I can say this from personal experience, because I wanted both of my kids to go to community college. And while they've taken community college classes, they are not at community colleges. One of the main pieces of advice I would give parents who have high school students looking at colleges is this is about their choice, not yours. I'm sure you talk about that on your what. Yeah,
but you can't ever say it enough.
No, you can't, because what worked for you, or what you thought would work for you, your child is they're themselves, right? And I think it's important, and you probably have talked about this book on the show, but our college choices are super important, but they don't define who we are as people.
Right.
You are not where you will go.
Yeah.
And so
where you'll go is not who you'll be, Frank Bruni.
There you go. Yeah. So I would keep those two things in mind. This is their search, not yours. And this is it's not going to define who they are as a person, as much as our institutions would like to think that it does.
Sure. Steve, give us a recommended resource related to community colleges, maybe a book or a website, just so that we all can educate ourselves a little bit more. And I mean, it sounds like the Aspen Institute, that would be a really good one as well. But any others?
Aspen would be top of the list. The other one would involve a little thought on the part of listeners, and that is to do a little research to find out where your local community college is. This is something I tell to journalists all the time. If you want to tell great positive stories about community impact, you've got them right under your nose at the community college. And many of them are they make great television, people becoming nurses and EMTs or working with robots or doing amazing things in classes. So find your local community college and take a look at what it's doing. You might have an easier time looking for the state association. So just put your state wherever you are, and then the words Community College Association. You usually get a list of all the community colleges in the state where you live, and get a sense of what they're doing regionally and locally. And again, I said it before, but the localness of our institutions is a key differentiator, something that really should make us grab your attention.
And I think you said you're on Twitter. And if anybody wants to follow you, to keep in touch with your work, where do you recommend they go?
So my Twitter handle is @LCC President, as in Lansing Community College President. I've sort of appointed myself a one-person news aggregator of positive stories about community colleges. So that's another thing if you're interested in community colleges.
You put the links up there.
I do all the time. So that's where I am on Twitter. And we also had the podcast that you mentioned, the End Community College Stigma podcast, which is on Apple, Stitcher, wherever you get your podcasts.
See, this has been great. I really appreciate you spending almost 50 minutes with us, and we're grateful, and keep up the good work, and go green, go white.
Yep. Go green. Thanks a lot, Mark. This is a fun conversation.
My pleasure. Take care. Friends, in our next episode on Monday, of course, we'll have our traditional announcements in college admissions, and then a fascinating interview with Dr. Angela MacGyver. Dr. Angela MacGyver is on a mission to make math fun. So she studied it all the way to the PhD level, and has come up with games and activities that engage students in elementary and middle school to make math incredibly fun. And I noticed it because I have multiple students who were just absolutely crushing the SAT. And they told me that that's because I did Dr. Angela MacGyver's program, Math Trapezium. So that's what we'll be talking about. Hope you'll tune in on Monday. See you next week, everybody. And don't forget, it's not where you go, but it's what you do when you get there, and it's what you do when you get out of there. College is not a prize to be won. It is a match to be made. See you next week. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us, and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 14. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel, and to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joy Stucker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stalianos Dimitru. If you want to have a coaching session with Lisa or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcast. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Thursday.